Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we cover the entirety of Dante's Divine Comedy. Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. Thus opens Dante's grand epic of love. But why did the pilgrim poet have to descend into hell, of all places, before he could climb Mount Purgatorio and take his seat in the blossoming bud of the white rose of heaven? The Divine Comedy is a love epic. It is the greatest love epic. It is the most ambitious love epic ever crafted by the hands of a mere mortal. Dante descends into hell to learn to love again by the most extreme examples of misdirected love, and also through his relationship with the Roman poet Virgil. That there is much depth to Dante is an understatement. There is much allegory, theology, political commentary, reflections on history, poetry, and economics that give life to Dante's brilliant masterpiece. There are many ways to understand the multi-layered world of hell, from its construction to why, at the lowest circle, rather than a fiery pandemonium, as imagined by John Milton, the lake of hell is cold, dark, and frozen. Yet the descent into the abyss that is the Inferno is in fact perplexing at first glance. When Dante begins his epic, he states that he is having a sort of midlife existential crisis. The poem is about him, but it is also more than about him. Dante says that midway along our life, he awoke to find himself in a dark wood because he had wandered off from the straight and true path. That straight and true path is the path of love. And Dante simultaneously informs us that our life is a life united together. All human beings seek love and happiness, but it is also about him, for he awoke in that dark wood, having wandered off the straight and true path. So at the very beginning of the poem, Dante tells us that the poem isn't just about him, it is about all humanity. It isn't surprising, given this reality, that the first proper circle of hell is the sphere of lust, the second circle in Dante's construction. Lust is the beginning of misdirected love, as evidenced by the pilgrim's discussion with the wounded lusters Francesca de Rimini and Paolo Malatesta. The two had carried on an illicit affair for over a decade. Francesca, in talking to Dante, subtly blames the poet for her sin. It was Dante's romance poetry that had captured the heart of Francesca and filled her with erotic intent that ultimately was her own doing. Dante nevertheless takes pity on Francesca and faints. In the beginning of all three parts of the Divine Comedy, Dante invokes poetry to guide him, and this is very important for us to realize. When we proceed to an understanding of Purgatorio, this aspect of Dante's construction, the role of poetry in our lives, is most important. O muses, O high genius, help me now, he frantically cries at the beginning of the second canto of the Inferno. Before ascending up the slopes of Mount Purgatorio, Dante also invokes the muses again. Here let death's poetry rise to life. O muses sacrosanct, whose liege I am, and let Calliope rise up and play. By the time he enters into heaven, Dante invokes Apollo. Beyond being the god of the sun, he was also the god of poetry. O great Apollo, For this final task, make me a vessel worthy to receive your genius and the longed-for laurel crown. It should also be noted, in a certain tradition of Catholic traditionalism and allegory, Apollo was a stand-in and prefiguration for Christ. Dante invokes the muses and gods of poetry in his journey because poetry, up through Dante's time, always had love as its great theme. The epic poetry of Homer, though surrounded by the maelstrom of war, chiefly concerns itself with the nature of love in that violent cosmos. I have a lecture on dealing with the theme of love in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The troubadours of Provence were love bards and poets who set the medieval world aflame, and Dante meets one such troubadour on his ascent up Mount Purgatory. But in the Latin mind, no greater love poet stood out than Dante's own guide through hell and purgatory. Virgil was the chief poet of love in the Roman world. His epic is a grand tale of love, which Dante feels insignificant in comparison to. I am not Aeneas, he tells Virgil before journeying to the underworld. Virgil's additional poetry, like the eclogues, also chiefly concerns itself with the nature of love. Omnia vincent amor, as Virgil famously wrote in Eclogue 10. By invoking the muses of poetry, and in being guided by Virgil, Dante tips his hand and reveals to the astute reader or listener that the journey into and through hell will require the flowering of love. Hell, after all, is a loveless place, and Dante's journey is one in which the muses of love must nurture him. The initial relationship between Dante and Virgil is standoffish and cold. While Virgil has been selected by Beatrice to help Dante, Virgil treats Dante more as an insolent child than a son. Virgil is, at the poem's beginning, more of a reluctant guide than a loving, compassionate one. He regularly accosts Dante for his stupid questions and repeated mistakes journeying through hell. Dante repeatedly faints, much to Virgil's chagrin. Two things are missing in their relationship when they enter into the gates, which infamously read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." There is a lack of trust between Dante and Virgil. As such, there is a lack of love between the two poets, for trust and love go together, especially in Christian theology. In fact, the two missing ingredients are also the two missing values that permeate hell itself. Moreover, the lack of trust and lack of love are also envisioned, as mentioned, as being united together. Without trust, there can be no love. Without love, there can be no trust. While the two poets come closer through their trials and tribulations, the first major transformation in Dante and Virgil's relationship is when they are at the gates of the city of Dis, entering into the sixth circle of hell. The famous Gorgon Medusa guards the entry. As she approaches the two, Virgil shields Dante's eyes. This is ironic for several reasons. First, Virgil had informed Dante not to look at Medusa's eyes after crossing over the river Styx. Virgil has come to care about Dante, as evidenced by the fact he informed Dante not to look into the seductive eyes of the formerly beautiful Gorgon, slayed by Perseus in Greek mythology. Dante, we mustn't forget, is still alive, while everyone else in hell is dead. If Dante looked into the eyes of Medusa, he would have been killed. Virgil's reminding Dante not to look into the eyes of the Gorgon was done out of an act of concern for the pilgrim poet. Second, the fact that Virgil shielded Dante's eyes also indicates a certain lack of trust. Despite informing Dante of the deadly powers of the Gorgon seductress, Virgil still places his arm and hand over Dante's face to prevent him from being turned to stone. Third, and perhaps most ironic of all, the fact that Dante has his eyes shielded by Virgil indicates Virgil's growing love for the poor pilgrim soul, even though the two still haven't reached that sacred bond of trust. We should also remember that the ninth circle of hell is reserved for all the traitors who betrayed the trust of their benefactors, country, or family. We'll return to this theme in a moment. The lack of trust between the two protagonists is soon remedied. Between cantos 19 and 21, there is a tremendous grace-filled metamorphosis between the two men. Dante makes the growing love exhibited between he and Virgil the central image in a place of horrifying and pitiable images. This is, in my view, intentional on the part of Dante. Because they are in hell, and hell is a loveless place, love needs to grow into a burning fire, oh the irony, as well as using biblical language, between Dante and Virgil, in order for the two to proceed down the abyss, in order to exit hell, and begin the long and arduous journey up Mount Purgatory. In the 19th canto, as the two are in the third Bolgia, the eighth circle of hell, Dante is tired, he is exhausted on the slopes of the mountain. Yet Dante wishes to have a conversation with one of the damned souls, soon to be revealed as Pope Nicholas III. Exhausted, Dante appeals to his master, now becoming father figure. "Who is that one, master? That angry wretch, who is writhing more than any of his comrades?" I asked. "The one licked by a redder flame." And he said to me, "If you want to be carried down along that lower bank to where he is, you can ask him who he is and why he's there." And I, Dante, answered, "My pleasure is what pleases you. You are my lord. You know that from your will I will not swerve. You even know my thoughts." Here is the first great expression of self-giving and sacrificial love in the whole of the Inferno. Moreover, trust between the two is growing, which allows for that self-giving love that binds the two souls together. For trust between persons, trust between souls, brings them united together, the very remedial and medical remedy to the problems of the fall of man, when Adam and Eve were severed in relationship to one another. Virgil takes Dante in his arms and whisks him down the slopes, as Dante romantically and poetically imagines. "Then he took hold of me with both his arms, and when he had me firm against his breast, he climbed back up the path he had just come down. He did not tire of the weight clasped tight to him, but brought me to the top of the bridge's arch, the one that joins the fourth bank to the fifth. And here he gently set his burden down, gently, for the ridge, so steep and rugged, would have been hard even for goats to cross. From there, another valley opened to me." There is no more fear or distrust in Dante reaching out and asking for Virgil's help at this point in the poem. Furthermore, Virgil is no longer incensed at Dante's questions and pitiable condition. As the intermediary guide, a sort of in persona Christi in the journey through hell, which is also esoterically referenced when Dante tells Virgil that he knows all his thoughts and that his will ought to be conformed to his, For those who are biblically literate, those are the same dictates Christ's command to his disciples in the Gospels. Virgil is now there, always beside Dante, whenever he is exhausted and cannot continue any longer. Love, as we begin to see in flesh and blood imagery, and most importantly activity, truly does conquer even the deepest levels of hell. Despite the progress made in loving each other, wherein Virgil has become more of a father to Dante than a mere guide, there is a final barrier for the two to overcome. There is a hidden, invisible wall the two have yet to cross. That hidden barrier is forgiveness. Though the two have learned to love each other in a self-giving and self-sacrificial way, with Virgil lifting up onto his being the burden that is Dante, the two have yet to learn the high value and virtue of forgiveness, the highest reality of love in the Christian theological tradition. Before they can proceed into the final circle of hell, this incredible literary construction on Dante's part must be realized. The two must learn to forgive each other as the highest expression of their learning to love. In the 13th canto, that final barrier of learning love is overcome. Dante, the typical childish pilgrim, as he is at times in the Inferno, begins to dally and waste time, absorbed in a debate between two narcissistic sinners, appropriately near a pond of water. Virgil is angered by Dante's dallying and accosts him. Dante tells us that in hearing Virgil's anger, he was filled with shame. Upon looking at the face of Dante, Virgil recognizes he has wronged Dante in his outburst of anger. Virgil tells Dante to forget about his outburst and forgive him. Dante pardons Virgil's outburst in the first and only act of loving forgiveness in the entire Inferno. I was listening, all absorbed in this debate, when the master said to me, "Keep right on looking a little more, and I shall lose my patience." I heard the note of anger in his voice and turned to him. I was so full of shame that it still haunts my memory today, like one asleep who dreams himself in trouble, and in his dream he wishes he were dreaming, longing for that which is, as if it were not. Just so I found myself, unable to speak, longing to beg for pardon, and already begging for pardon, not knowing that I did. Less shame than yours would wash away a fault greater than yours has been, my master said, and so forget about it. Do not be sad. If I ever again should meet up with men engaging in this kind of futile wrangling, remember, I am always at your side. To have a taste for talk like this is vulgar. This moment in the Inferno is important because, as mentioned, it is the only instance of forgiveness in the poem. Had the two not learned forgiveness, they would have been trapped in hell for all eternity. Without a moment of forgiveness, the journey to learn how to love again would have failed. Without forgiveness, Dante and Virgil would have been trapped in the 8th circle of hell. Without forgiveness, the reconciling reality of love, which moves the stars, would never have been revealed. In forgiveness, Dante realizes he has a fatherly figure, always at his side. In Dante's sojourn through hell, the great pilgrim poet learned to love again. It was his forgetting how to love that caused him to wander from the straight and true and into a dark wood, reminiscent of the cold darkness of hell. The dark, cold wood prefigures the hell that Dante travels through. Hell is a cold, dark, and most importantly for us to understand, a loveless place. The only light, warmth, and love that flickered through the 9 circles was the love that Dante and Virgil learned in the presence of each other. And we should note how that in hell, everyone has a certain separation from one another. The lustful lovers can never satisfy and come together like Francesca and Paolo. The Epicureans are divided in their tombs. And in the very last circle of hell, people, souls who have betrayed their benefactors, are frozen in place. Having learned love, Dante and Virgil conquered hell together and began their ascent up Mount Purgatory with the beautiful stars, those grand lights of beauty and love, as their guide. I saw the lovely things the heavens hold, and we came out to see once more the stars. Here, let death's poetry arise to life. O muses sacrosanct, whose liege I am, and let Calliope rise up and play her sweet accompaniment in the same strain that pierced the wretched magpies with the truth of unforgivable presumptuousness. Thus opens Dante's Purgatory. That was Dante's opening prayer as he entered Purgatory, having just left hell. And so now Dante prepares to climb the 7-story mountain of love, having called on the love of poetry to rise up that which is dead. Dante's Divine Comedy is more than just the Florentine's fantasy of revenge and poetic allegory of the Christian faith. In many ways, it was an epic paying homage to the book, interweaving, however, the history of love from the pen of mortals to be concurrent with the drama of salvation revealed in Scripture. As we mentioned in covering the Inferno, it is no secret that Dante is guided by a poet, a love poet, Virgil, and that he meets the other great poets in limbo before journeying into the dark crevices of the Inferno. Dante wandering in a dark wilderness for having wandered off the straight path prefigures and foreshadows what the rest of the 100 cantos of the poem will deal with, fleeing from that dark wilderness and returning to the straight and true. By wandering from the straight and true, Dante had strayed from love, and by finding himself in a dark wilderness, a dark forest, a blackened environment which blinds him, he had flung himself into hell by his aimless wandering. Sent by Beatrice, Dante's human love, Virgil rescues him, and the two begin their infamous journey to hell and back. It is noteworthy to recognize, again, that a poet comes to guide him back to the straight and true. There are many figures whom Dante meets and converses with throughout the Divine Comedy. Why Virgil? Why Beatrice? Why Statius? Why Bernard of Clairvaux? There is also much symbolism in the imagery of Dante's descent through hell and ascent into heaven. Again, why is hell cold and dark? As we mentioned, it is cold and dark because there is no love, no wisdom in hell. Why is purgatory a place that has light? Hint, purgatory is a place where the flame of love is beating within the souls, guiding us to heaven. Why is heaven the realm of the white rose? Here we shall briefly explore these questions. There is a poetic genius to Dante's journey through hell and up Mount Purgatory. As to why Dante would choose Virgil to guide him through hell and most of Purgatory should be clear enough, especially having covered the Inferno. Virgil was the great Roman poet of love. Omnia vincent amor. Love conquers all. Additionally, the Aeneid is a grand tale of love, where Aeneas embodies the love for family and fatherland through his arduous and painstaking journey to Lavinian shores. Aeneas' love for his father, his gods, and his countrymen drives him onward across the Mediterranean. And as we noted, when Dante enters hell, he tells Virgil, "I am not Aeneas," which can also be read as, "I am not a lover." But yet, that is precisely what Dante becomes. He becomes a lover similar to the great patriot Aeneas from Virgil's poetic masterpiece. The relationship, as mentioned, between Virgil and Dante is one of the most important developments for the reader to have noticed over the course of the epic. Virgil, again, meets Dante under the direction of Beatrice. He serves as a functionary more than a friend and father figure in the opening cantos. When they begin their descent into hell, Virgil has a short temper with Dante and answers Dante's questions with a frank coldness, reminiscent of the place they are descending into. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Moving beyond the realm of the neutrals into limbo, Dante, as mentioned, is present with the great poets of antiquity. Hell begins with the poets, but the poets of love and of ancient lore have done enough to keep themselves from the punishment of what lay beyond limbo. As Virgil and Dante descend through the remaining circles of hell, as we covered, their relationship is tested, strained, but also transformed. And that transformation is what helps guide Virgil and Dante out of the circles of hell. Hell, as we've mentioned, is a loveless place. This is the primary reason why Dante constructs a cold and dark hell, and why it gets progressively colder and darker as they moved into a place where no light is. Dante's facial complexion changes too, to symbolize the reality of entering the inferno of death. He becomes paler and paler as they journey through the circles of hell. But as the two poets of love pilgrimage through hell and descend into that dark abyss, which is Satan's domain, it is the love of Dante and Virgil that enables them to proceed in their journey. They become the only shining conduits of love, of light, in a place where no love and no light is. Dante and Virgil bond with each other, and the two grow intimately connected to each other as they proceed down the circles of the abyss. In order to continue the journey through the loveless pit that is hell, they need to embody the love that is lacking from all the circles of hell. Virgil's concern for Dante is revealed, as we recall, when Virgil shields Dante from the head of Medusa. His actions, though loving, as we mentioned, reflect a certain lack of trust between the two. The lack of trust is what must be overcome in the 6 through 9 circles of hell, where a definitive rejection of truth and trust is what permeates these lower circles of the cold and dark pit. And as we recall from the section covering the Inferno, that forgiveness is precisely what must occur in order for them to proceed out of hell. Virgil's asking for forgiveness and Dante's granting of forgiveness is the only moment of forgiveness in the Inferno. This cannot be understated and must be understood by the reader. Love consummated itself in that act of forgiveness, whereby the two pilgrim poets were able to venture into the loveless and unforgiving lair of Lucifer and all the human souls who malevolently betrayed the trust and love of others. The genius of Dante is fully revealed in this brief but touching, indeed human scene in the journey through hell. It is as if there was a moral, hidden, unseen barrier that the two needed to cross before descending into the final dark hole of the abyss. Without that consummated love, through forgiveness, Virgil and Dante would have been stuck in the 8th circle of hell forever. As mentioned, it was in hell and through hell that Dante began to learn love once more. He learned the bonding nature of love, that it is not good to be alone, as he was when we first met him, wandering alone in the wilderness. He learned through the bonding nature of love that love requires relationships. He learned that love requires trust, which was exhibited with the trust built between Virgil and Dante. He also learned that love requires, most importantly, forgiveness, realized in that final and touching, most human episode in the 30th canto between Virgil and Dante, which opened up the final circle of hell to them, where their love conquered death and allowed them to slip down the body of the beast and wind up at the base of Mount Purgatory, the mountain of love connecting the human world with the celestial realm of complete and total love. Ascending Mount Purgatory is a grueling task for Dante. He is proud and therefore weighed down by his pride. Mount Purgatory has the most human of characteristics, for it is the most human of all the realms. Where hell saw the rejection of humanists through the corruption of love, in the circles of lust through wrath, and the formal rejection of truth and love, all the rungs of hell inside the city of Dis, Mount Purgatory is the place where love is nurtured, directed, and eventually realized at the top of the mountain. Through this realization of love, the opening up of the gates of heaven for all the pilgrims of love to enter commences. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that the soul is potentiality, moving to actualization. In that actualization, which is found in agency, the understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful, which all souls are directed to, realizes itself in the freedom to choose the good, the true, and the beautiful. Of course, what is that force, that reality, which moves the soul to actualization and the choosing of God's goodness and beauty? It is love. Love is called the unitive force, the angelic doctor explained in the Summa Theologia. Love is the force that binds all things together in unitive harmony. It is important to recognize that while hell was a cold and dark, Mount Purgatory is a place where light and warmth is found. The sun appears where it had no appearance before in hell. Moreover, it is equally important to realize that the souls make their progress up the mountain of purifying love during the sunlight. That sunlight is symbolic of love and wisdom, the light which draws burning hearts after it. St. Paul teaches in his epistles that God is an all-consuming fire, and when the consuming fire of God is visible and beautifies the world of purgatory, the souls, moved by that love, ascend closer to paradise before being able to pass from the earthly Jerusalem to the celestial Jerusalem. The most important person Virgil and Dante meet in their pilgrimage up Mount Purgatory is the poet Statius. Statius is the author of the epic poem Thebaid, the second greatest Latin epic only after Virgil's Aeneid. Statius serves many purposes in the poem. He is the heir, the direct heir of Virgil, and he was, according to Dante, a secret convert to Christianity, which was a common idea in early Christian tradition. As such, not only is Statius the heir to Virgil poetically and historically, he is the heir to Virgil as the poet instructor of love to Dante as they reach the top of Mount Purgatory. In that ascent, the poets all converse with one another about love, about the only thing that matters in life. Statius is also the bridge connecting pagan Rome to Christian Rome. Statius represents the supersession of Virgil into the baptizing waters of Christianity. Dante pays the great poet his homage by including him in the moving entourage of love poets, now numbering symbolically, we should note, 3, as they progress ever closer to the celestial realm of love, which they had all written about in their own ways. The 3 poets of love in Purgatorio are burning and sojourning hearts of love, who also engage in face-to-face conversations with one another, again, sacramentally and symbolically, prefiguring and foreshadowing the Trinity that is in heaven, the ultimate destination for those journeying up Mount Purgatory. They are then the poetic manifestation of the Trinity, for they are in a loving union with each other and engaged in acts of speech with one another, acts of speech which reflect their love, just how it was an act of speech, an act of love by which God created the world, and acts of speech, acts of love that God communicated with his people. Statius becomes the poet who symbolizes the passing of the torch of love poetry to Dante, just as he took up the torch from Virgil, and now with Virgil and Statius having traveled with Dante, and Virgil having returned to limbo, the great flame passes to the immortal Florentine as they prepare to enter the realm of the White Rose. Dante's inclusion of Statius in the pilgrimage is, therefore, theological and poetic. As mentioned, there are three poets journeying together up the mountain to enter the realm of the Trinity. Virgil may be relieved by Beatrice, thus keeping the pilgrim group at three, but the number three becomes a central guiding spirit in Purgatorio. Additionally, that all three are poets and all three Romans allows Dante to communicate the power and directionality of poetry. Again, as Dante's prayer opened up, rise up from the dead. Poetry can lift us up to life and bring us into heaven. Moreover, Dante's inclusion of many poets, some famous and others largely lost to history, is equally deep and essential to the movement of the Divine Comedy. If Dante's epic is the story of the drama of salvation, the greatest drama and story ever told, it is also the story of the history of love poetry, from Hesiod and Homer, whom we met in Limbo, through Virgil and Statius, up to Arnott Daniel, Guido Guinizelli, and Bonacinta Orbacciano, and Dante. Hear from the dead, let poetry rise up, O sacred muses, since I am yours, as Dante poetically and magically began. Dante opened Purgatorio by brilliantly prefiguring what the journey up Mount Purgatory reveals, just as he had done in the opening lines of the Inferno, where he cried out to the muses for help. O muses, ho high genius, help me now. He is also informing his reader that poetry, as mentioned, can lead to conversion and turn the human gaze up to heavenly things. In fact, without poetry, without love, we cannot ascend to the stars. That is the fundamental message of Purgatorio, just as it was in the Inferno. Paradise, then, is the land to which all poetry directs the human heart and mind, and, in another sense, is the land of poetic abundance, where poetry, which is Dante's essential symbolism and allegory of love, never ceases. Poetry, we must understand, is the metaphor for love in the Divine Comedy. It is fitting that Dante's epic of love has the poets and theologians of love, who are poets in their own right, guiding him into the land of the White Rose, the very flower of love and life. Where the poets directed Dante to the celestial sphere, it is Beatrice who teaches Dante to always love God, and the great mystic theologian, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who explains to Dante the love of God which guides Dante through the heavenly spheres of love itself. Love literally carried Dante through hell, as we recall, when Virgil, the great poet of love, put him on his back. Love called Dante up Mount Purgatory. Love then instructed Dante in the cardinal and theological virtues during the many conversations climbing Mount Purgatory. We find then that Dante learned love in order to escape hell. In purgatory, he is guided and ordered by love to ascend toward the heavenly realm. In heaven, he is guided and transfigured by love to meet love's very face. Having ordered his love and guided by poetry, again the metaphor for love in the Divine Comedy, Dante is ready to enter the realm of the white rose. The stars are once more the luminaries of beauty that capture his eye, while also reminding us of new growth. From those holiest waters I return, to her reborn, a tree renewed in bloom, with newborn foliage, immaculate, eager to rise, now ready for the stars. Dante's Divine Comedy is the greatest work of Christian literature, one of the greatest epic poems ever construed by human hands, and perhaps the greatest love song ever written by a mortal human being. T.S. Eliot famously said the world is divided between Dante and Shakespeare, and that there is no other in running contention. There are many facets and nuances to Dante's poetic splendor, as we've been discussing, but now I would like to examine Beatrice as a type of Christ, that in persona Christi that would have been familiar to Dante's sacramental vision of the world and of others, wherein Beatrice acts like a poet-prophet of the Old Testament, pointing the way to Christ before being superseded by Christ himself. The Inferno opens with those famous lines, "Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path." Dante's opening is remarkable in capturing everything about the human pilgrimage, about the human life. He is having a quintessential midlife crisis, so to speak, and recognizing his aimless wandering, but not knowing how he sunk into the abyss that he is in. He craves meaning and purpose. He craves understanding. In awakening to find himself in a dark wood, he is aware of his sin, his desolation, his utter emptiness for having wandered off the straight and true path of love. Indeed, the entire movement of the epic, as we've been discussing, is a pilgrimage through love. Dante learns how to love in hell, learns how to order his love in purgatory, and learns the nature of divine love in heaven. When Virgil informs Dante that he is to be his guide through hell, the Roman poet informs the new Roman poet that a beautiful lady had summoned him and commanded him to help rescue the pilgrim poet from his aimless wandering. Beatrice's first invocation in the epic is as an angel of beauty and grace, with eyes of light more bright than any star. In low, soft tones she started to address me, in her own language, with an angel's voice. Though Beatrice is absent during Dante's sojourn through hell with Virgil, she is with him in spirit, through his sacramental guide, Virgil, who has directly received the command from Beatrice's own voice, much like how the priests and the prophets of the Old Testament are the in persona Christi in that part of sacred scripture. Here is part of Dante's brilliance. He needs others, not just God, to guide him back to the straight and true. And thus, the pilgrim Dante is always with someone instead of being alone, like Christian in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. The awakening of Dante to new life then begins with hearing the call of Beatrice through another, much like how God spoke through the patriarchs, the priests, and the prophets in the Old Testament. When the prophets speak to the people of Israel in the Old Testament history, they often begin with, "Thus saith the Lord," or "Hear the Lord thy God." The Church's hermeneutical principle of typology led the official interpretation of the canon to mean that God, Christ, was literally speaking through the sages and prophets of old, though he himself was not yet revealed in the flesh. Dante is drawing upon this hermeneutical tradition when constructing his poem. Again, in the Old Testament history, you hear the prophets and the priests say, "Thus saith the Lord," or "Hear the Lord thy God." Beatrice doesn't appear to Dante until the 30th canto of Purgatorio. She is introduced as the embodiment of faith, hope, and love, the three theological virtues according to Christianity. Covering all the chariot, Dante says, appeared a lady, over her white veil, an olive crown, and under her green cloak, her gown the color of eternal flame. The colors that adorn her splendid gown each represent one of the virtues, white being faith, green being hope, and red, the eternal flame, being love. That Beatrice is dressed as she is in the colors of the theological virtues give a prefiguration of the transfigured glory of heaven and all the souls therein. Dante, as we know, had fallen into darkness. Now it is the beauty of Beatrice that is so majestic that it whets his appetites for more. But, more incredibly, her beauty orders his appetites to the proper order of things as established by God. And with the help of Beatrice, who reminds Dante to order his desires always to God. The arrival of Beatrice not only represents the supersession of pagan Rome represented by Virgil, she also bears the three virtues which remind us of the Trinity, appropriate given that Dante is about to enter the abundant abode of the Trinity. Her radiance is now that which will guide Dante in the realm of love itself, and her guidance is that of teacher and comforter, like the great teacher and comforter who walked the sands of Galilee. Beatrice has become a literal vessel of light in the darkness. She brings illumination to the world ruined by darkness. As Beatrice begins to guide Dante through the spheres of heaven, she reminds him, "Direct your mind and gratitude to God, who raised us up to his first star." Like Christ, Beatrice's role here is to remind us of God above all things. Like Christ, she leads the way for the wayward pilgrim to be directed to all things good, true, and beautiful. She has become Dante's teacher about the truths of the cosmos, of life, and of salvation. Among all things, however disparate, there reigns an order, and this gives the form that makes the universe resemble God. Therein God's higher creatures see the imprint of eternal excellence, that goal for which the system is created. And in this order, all created things, according to their bent, maintain their place, disposed in proper distance from their source. Therefore they move all to a different port, across the vast ocean of being, and each endowed with its own instinct as guide. This is what carries fire toward the moon, this moving force of mortal heart. This is what binds the earth and makes it one. Love, according to Beatrice, is the law of life, the law of the cosmos, and the law that makes all things whole. Love is what orders our lives to derive the happiness that we instinctively seek. As she later tells Dante, as they near the central sphere of heaven, "On that point depend all nature and all the heavens. Observe the circle nearest it, and know the reason for its spinning at such speed is that love's fire burns it into motion." As Dante grows with Beatrice, in his understanding of love, the divine love that unaided reason cannot know, the formerly overburdening beauty which shamed Virgil and Dante, is transformed into a blessed and joyful smile that brings only happiness whenever Dante looks upon her face. Instead of fear, shame, or trembling, Dante is now enraptured by her beauty and wisdom. Moreover, after meeting the wise men of the fourth sphere of heaven, including King Solomon, Saint Albertus Magnus, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, Beatrice reminds Dante to still give thanks to God. Then Beatrice said, "And now give thanks to the Son of Angels, by whose grace you have ascended to this sun of sense." Dante tells us, "No mortal heart was ever more disposed to do devotion and to yield itself to God so fully and readily." Beatrice's words are efficacious to the pilgrim, just as Christ's words are efficacious to those who hear and obey. In Paradise, Beatrice is a sort of high priest, conductor, and prophetess to the pilgrim Dante. She reveals to him the intricacies of the cosmos. She reveals to him how the divine love of heaven, the true love of God, is self-giving and freely receptive, and that all other types of love fall short in comparison to this free-giving and freely receptive love that binds together the Trinity and the whole of the cosmos. It is the self-giving and receiving love of the Trinity which flows forth to create and order all things to love. In the Eastern tradition of Christianity, the Greek tradition, this is called perichoresis, the eternal dance of the Trinity in overabundant beauty and love. Like Mass, heaven is a place of constant worship, music, and harmony. Songs break out in perfect melody. Prayers are heard by the many congregants, so to speak, who are present in the cathedral that is heaven. For example, after Justinian's discourse, he ends with joyful prayer, "Hosanna Sanctus Deus Sabaoth, super istrans claritate tua, felicis ignes orum malakoth." Hosanna, holy God of hosts, you illuminate with your brightness the blessed flame of these realms. This prayer by Justinian is apt because as Dante proceeds through the additional spheres of heaven, Paradise grows brighter and more beautiful as he journeys closer and closer to the Trinity itself. All the while, with Beatrice as his companion, his light in the darkness, his first fruit guide to divine love itself, Dante is transfigured and transformed in Beatrice's presence and through Beatrice's wisdom. In fact, Dante's purification, transfiguration, and transformation is contingent with the light and wisdom of Beatrice, just as our purification, transfiguration, and transformation is contingent with the light and wisdom of Christ. Through the course of the poem, God uses Beatrice to reach out to Dante to bring back this wayward son. Like the Old Testament prophets, whom God used to reach out to his wayward sons and daughters prior to the coming of Christ, Beatrice is the instantiated person from whom God's wisdom and grace flows to those who need it, specifically Dante. And like the Old Testament prophets, whom Christ spoke through, divine wisdom itself also speaks through Beatrice. Beatrice was everything to Dante, as we know. This produced the double-edged sword that led Dante wayward after her death. Dante loved Beatrice to the point of forgetting God. Beatrice's arrival begins with a rebuke. She accosts Dante for having strayed after her death. Yet God knew the love that Dante had for Beatrice. So he sent Beatrice to resurrect him, so to speak. In this way, Beatrice is acting in prefiguration, that which Christ does: resurrect us from the dead and usher us into the gates of paradise, which is precisely what Beatrice does for Dante. Beatrice is at once Dante's downfall and salvation simultaneously. And so Beatrice is again reminiscent of the prefigured Christ of the prophets. The prophets were the double-edged sword that caused carnal Israel so much trouble during their existence. The prophets accost the people for forgetting God. The people, in turn, begin to idolize some of the prophets instead of God, or in the case of Jeremiah, loathe the prophet altogether and attempt to kill him. The prophets are sent by God to resurrect his people. The prophets were, at once, the downfall and salvation of Old Testament Israel. They came to announce judgment. They also came to announce repentance and wisdom, as does Beatrice to Dante. In her final words of instruction to the pilgrim poet, she reminds him of the coming judgment and resurrection, like the prophet Isaiah to the Israelites long ago. The greater goodness makes for greater bliss. A greater bliss calls for a greater body, if it is perfect in all of its parts. Therefore, this sphere, which sweeps all the world along with it, must correspond to this, the inner ring that loves and knows most. The prophets, however, were not God in the flesh. They were, at most, a type of Christ, who foreshadowed and prefigured the Messiah and God whom the Israelites waited on. Likewise, Beatrice is not Christ. She is not the Son who bore the iniquities of the world and conquered Hades, leading captive souls from limbo into heaven, and whom we, as pilgrims on earth, need to follow in our upward ascent on high. This is why, repeatedly, Beatrice reminds Dante to keep his mind and eyes set on the true prize that is Christ. After reminding Dante of this truth, he repeatedly tells how Beatrice's words devoted to him to cleave onto that which he had abandoned at the poem's beginning. The Old Testament patriarchs and prophets pointed the way to Christ. They were individuals whom God used to reach out and instruct his sons and daughters. In every way, Beatrice mirrors this typological and sacramental reality. God sent Beatrice to reach out and instruct Dante to bring him back to the flock. But in doing so, Beatrice speaks the eternal wisdom of love, just as the prophets did. Thus, it is not Beatrice per se who is speaking to Dante. It is God speaking through Beatrice to reach the formerly obstinate and prideful poet. Dante sees Beatrice, but he hears love itself in her voice and in her touching. It is in his hearing love that allows for his transfiguration and ascent through the spheres of heaven. As the two pilgrimage closer and closer to the final sphere, Beatrice is subsequently superseded by another gatekeeper, another type of Christ. The great theologian of love in the medieval world, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. However, Beatrice, as a type of Christ, effected such great transformation in Dante that it is appropriate that she, like the Old Testament prophets, would leave him. Elijah was assumed up into heaven, and some Jewish apocalypticists waited for his return. Elijah, however, was not the Messiah, though Elijah was a prefiguration of the Messiah in many ways. They had their eyes, speaking of the Jewish apocalypticists, set on the wrong thing, having forgotten what Elijah had taught them. The greatest of the prophets, John the Baptist, paved the way for Christ before fading away and giving way to Christ. This, in fact, is the reality that all the prophets follow in the Bible. Beatrice follows this biblical and typological pattern in the poem. God does not leave man alone, let alone his sons and daughters, without teaching and instruction from other humans. The Old Testament is filled with teaching and instruction. Christ's very ministry was grounded in teaching and instruction. Beatrice served as the agent of teaching and instruction to help perfect Dante's nature with the supernatural grace and love needed to transfigure a broken and wounded man into a blossoming flower of life. Thus, as Dante nears the heavenly bud to behold Christ and the Blessed Trinity, Beatrice fades away to take her place among the choir of angels and saints to give praise to God. The tripartite journey to heaven is now complete. We realize at long last that Dante learned love in hell, ordered his love in purgatory, and now enjoys the eternal fruit of love in heaven. As the Trinity takes center stage in Dante's heart and eyes, he takes his place in the eternal choir to sing, quote, of the love that moves the sun and the other stars.